Good evening. I'm Phil Aaron, editor of the Daily Times and DelcoTimes.com. Welcome back to another live edition of our live stream internet program. We call this little show Live from the Newsroom. It's where we take the people and the issues that are making headlines here in Delaware County. We bring some of those people together in our newsroom in beautiful downtown Primos, and we talk about the issues of the day. We are once again tonight out on the road. This is the final installment of our glorious partnership with Widener University in the city of Chester, and we are once again located in the brand spanking new Freedom Hall on the campus of Widener, home of their communications department and their state-of-the-art television studio, slightly better than the studio that we have in beautiful downtown Primos. Tonight we're going to turn our attention not necessarily to news, not necessarily the features, to something really much more important than that. We're going to talk some sports tonight, and if it is spring, that means that a young man's fancy turns to baseball. But since we're going to talk about sports, we'll pretty much eliminate talking about the Phillies tonight, and we will instead talk about the Flyers and a somewhat unexpected Stanley Cup playoff run. A reminder to our viewers, we're an interactive show. You can log on to DelcoTimes.com, take part in a live chat. We've been soliciting some questions for our panel during the day, and we'll get to some of those questions in a little bit. I'm joined tonight by several members of our sports department at the Daily Times. We're going to talk a little bit about Flyers. We even have our Eagles beat writer here, and as well as our Union Major League Soccer beat writer. Since we are, in fact, in the city of Chester, we'll talk a little bit about the Union, which plays their home games right here in the city of Chester. To my immediate right is our sports editor and Flyers beat writer, Rob Parent. And then as we move farther out, Matt DeGeorge is a sports writer who also covers the Union for us. And apropos enough, since we're talking hockey, Matt is just off the weekend in the Frozen Four competition down at the Wells Fargo Center. And out on our far right on the lonesome end out there is our Eagles beat writer, Bob Groats. Rob, I'm going to start with you. Getting off to a, I guess you could call it a woeful start, at least an 0-3 start. The Flyers are, in fact, in the playoffs. Anybody expect that?
Woeful's an understatement, Phil. They went 0-3 and then they went 1-7
after the move.
And I believe they were up to 3-7 and rolling. And after that, and really didn't get it turned around until a West Coast trip after Christmas.
Right. Yeah.
But started to play very solidly after that. Had a tremendous month of February and month of March, and we're playing real well until this last little stretch drive. They played a number of really, really excellent teams in a row, got a lot of points out of those games, and then hit the skids a little bit and finished up sliding a little to a degree. But I believe for the New York Rangers, they're going to be ready, and I think it's going to be a very competitive series.
Were you surprised that early after just 3 games when Ed Snyder, obviously a guy who's known to have somewhat of a quick trigger, went ahead and pulled the plug on Peter Laviolette and moved to Craig Berube?
Yeah, I mean, for once, I don't think this was Ed's call. Certainly not completely. I think Paul Holmgren went out on a limb to keep Laviolette over the summer. And this was after, to be honest, I was told this was after a situation of where Holmgren had to be talked out of firing him last season. Yeah. And, kept him over the summer. They had a terrible training camp. They had a very disjointed
Ed Snyder called
situation.
It the worst camp he's ever seen.
Yeah, and he had to be told that, by the way. But I think he might have been even a little surprised at how quickly this happened. But, of course, Ed does sign off on all the decisions, and I think this was Paul Holmgren's call. Yeah. Craig Berube was brought here as an assistant coach a number of years ago for a reason, and that's because Paul always did respect the guy. Yeah. He was a Flyers fighter back in the day, but they talked hockey all the time. Paul worked for the organization then. And, Craig has done a tremendous job this year.
Matt, a guy who's covered a lot of different teams, a lot of different coaches, do we make too much of this coaching thing and the idea of a change in the middle, really early in the stream, you could say?
I think it's a little tough to measure the Berube versus Laviolette, their difference making, obviously because Laviolette had such a short time to work with them, and at least this year. And you could always play devil's advocate and say, well, with more time, Laviolette would have found the same things, teased out the same details, righted the ship maybe in a similar way. But the fact remains that Berube has gotten them this far in an Eastern Conference that, it's not the deepest that the conference has been, but it's certainly a challenging field. And to have gotten them to the playoffs a first-time head coach, a lot of different factors that he's trying to measure this season, everything that's gone on with the goaltending situation, so many injuries and long-term changes. It's a pretty impressive job, and you have to think that the ownership and the higher-ups certainly take a little bit of ownership in that process and some of the credit for the job he's done.
Yeah.
I kind of
Bob Groats, I was going to ask you
Yeah.
the change, the culture change in looking at a team that you cover all the time, the Eagles, that had a coach for 14 years, and Ed Snyder changes coaches like some of us go through our underwear, for God's sake.
I mean, it definitely was different. But, Berube, I don't know, with all due respect, I just think his style is a little bit different than Laviolette.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a ton of 20-goal scorers this year. It's much more spread out. Whether that's going to continue in the playoffs, I mean, this is going to be really interesting. If you had that many guys that can score, you should be in pretty decent shape. Now, I realize, the goaltender situation, the injury there to the starter, that could be obviously an issue. But I kind of like that about Berube. However he did it, he seems to have gotten some other guys involved. He seems to have gotten their attention. I don't know, maybe a little bit more sense of an urgency. Maybe they got used to Laviolette. But it's going to be interesting because I still think that there's a lot of jobs. Going to be a lot of jobs at stake in this round of the playoffs.
I think that's a really good point. I think their style change sort of bred a little bit of more balance offensively on the club, and he also gave a lot of ice time to guys that normally wouldn't have seen that if Peter Laviolette had stayed on.
Yeah. Rob, a lot of it was made at when they made that change again, when Ed Snyder decided to go ahead and make that change 3 games into the season. There was talk about, I guess you would call the so-called Flyers culture, and whether or not it was time for Ed Snyder to really not just change the coach and bring in another guy from inside, but really change that locker room, shake it up a little bit.
I can't get our columnists to stop talking about culture
I was going to say, it's a shame Jack's not here.
I was hoping Jack was going to be here, because that's his question.
The culture really stemmed from a question by Inquirer columnist Mike Sealski. It's become sort of a press box running joke, and but it was a good. Actually, it was a very good question, because at that time it seemed like Ed Snyder's team, which was built for the Stanley Cup playoffs of 1972 as a rough and tumble, they're not going to beat us up anymore kind of thing, it still seemed like by making Craig Berube a head coach, they were still going to stick with that kind of culture, quote unquote. I mean, there's been quick teams, there's been tough teams, there's been good skating teams, there's been all kinds of different teams in Flyers uniforms over the years. And I've covered too many seasons to even want to admit it, but as a culture change kind of thing, Berube is not the kind of a head coach that goes out there and says, you run this guy, like Mike Keenan used to be.
Yeah.
He's not that kind of a guy. He wants to get away from he thinks he repeated through the season, they take too many damn penalties.
Yeah.
And that is one of their biggest flaws as a club. Now, at the same time, they draw a lot of penalties too.
Yeah.
So they are a team that not only can play tough, but also can really skate if they want to.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big things with Berube is when you look at what he's done with some of these guys that have a physical edge to their game. Guys like Wayne Simmons, even Scott Hartnell's. Well,
There you on the border.
yeah, he's got a few edges. But guys
that
that
doesn't take any bad penalties.
yeah, well, sure. But I mean, guys that are skilled but are also physical, and that's I think going to come into play big time in the postseason because everything gets ratcheted up, everything gets more physical, and you have to be able to play and withstand that kind of physicality. And the fact that the Flyers seem to have forwards that are skilled, but they're not pushovers. And we've seen what happens to teams. I think of the Capitals being the main team. Is they've gone into the postseason with soft, skilled forwards, and they don't tend to last. And that's not what this Flyers team is.
And that culture change is interesting. I don't think you'll ever see something in the NHL, at least not for the immediate future, like the Eagles did with Chip Kelly with the college thing, where he starts off with the protein shakes. I'm going to shake up the locker room, instead of the quarterbacks together, I'm going to put them next to a safety and that type of thing. And then we're going to play real loud music at practice, so everybody gets a headache so they can focus on what they're doing. I don't think you're going to see that in the NHL, but, and I guess really the NHL is kind of in terms of that kind of thing, it's sort of a slow-changing league. Everybody pretty much does the same thing.
I don't think you're ever
yeah.
going to see that on any field of adult behavior.
Yeah.
But it worked.
It really, yeah, it worked for a year. I mean, is it going to work down the line? That's going to be interesting. But
Let's talk a little bit about some individuals